GAYTON MCKENZIE just did something you don't see every day in South African politics. He admitted he was wrong. That's right, the fiery leader of the Patriotic Alliance has officially apologized to the SABC after accusing them of backing a podcast that allegedly insulted the colored community.
All right, let's now welcome Mr. William Bird, who's the Director of Media Monitoring Africa, to weigh in on this discussion. William, great to have you with us on the show this afternoon. Now, you were recently part of a gathering on finding some ways, right, to regulate the social media space, especially pertaining to news and how podcasters aren't, in fact, some podcasters, in fact, let me say that, aren't well-researched journalists, and that theirs is mostly a personal opinion. And the conundrum there was then, how does the public actually receive or interpret some of what they said? Let's look at the incident in question, right? It speaks to exactly this, but what type of action can be taken against the podcaster in your view?
The first thing is that the minister was correct to say that we need to condemn racism. Bitterly ironic that he himself then is guilty of Afrophobia. Be that as it may, there are a number of things that can be done. The first is that he said that this was being carried on MultiChoice's platform. Now, because of that, they can actually lodge a complaint with the Broadcast Complaints Commission, because it was broadcast on a MultiChoice platform, and I would strongly advise them to go ahead and do that as their first port of call. The second thing is that if they believe that the words constitute hate speech, then what they should be doing is taking it and reporting it to the South African Human Rights Commission. They're the body tasked with determining and addressing hate speech, because there they can open a case with the Equality Court. So while podcasts that are not connected to any broadcaster, for example, on the MultiChoice channel, or if they are an SABC podcast that is broadcast by SABC, then it would fall under the BCCSA. While some of those that then aren't linked to any of those seem to not have any kind of self-regulatory structure, the South African Human Rights Commission is empowered to go after and to make sure that those people can be held accountable.
Absolutely. I mean, William, talk to us about what is your observation also on the current uptick of podcasters and podcasts in South Africa. We're just talking about journalistic ethics in relation to the attempted bribery story earlier on, William, and we concluded that it's quite easier for media houses, as you've also just rightfully pointed out, and employers of journalists to hold their employees to account. But in this matter, I mean, the Sports and Culture Minister took a swipe without giving alternative reforms also of how this space can actually be monitored or even regulated. Every day there are new podcasts mushrooming, hosted by people we don't know, with different views and opinions, talking about a wide range of current affairs as well as other issues of concern, William. So how do we then strive and strike that balance in terms of the responsibility, one, by the podcasters as well as those platforms that actually give them the platform to give out their opinion, so to say?
So really it comes down to matters of remedy, right? Which is, so any podcaster now, if they wish to, they can join the Press Council of South Africa, and then they will fall under their code. And what that means is that if someone has a complaint, they don't need to go to the courts, they don't need to go to the Equality Court, for example, or to the Human Rights Commission. They can just go to the Press Council and have the issue addressed there. When you're dealing with a very serious issue like hate speech, for example, then it is important to make sure that you get that addressed by the South African Human Rights Commission, because hate speech is a human rights violation, and determining it is quite a tricky thing to do. So either you can belong to the Press Council, in which case you've got a form of recourse. If you don't, in other words, if you're just a podcaster that's broadcasting, and streaming your podcast on any number of platforms, and someone has a complaint like that against you, they can't report you to the South African Human Rights Commission. And when you're there, the South African Human Rights Commission can then call you in, even if you're not based in South Africa. The challenge, of course, comes in that there are literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of podcasts all over the world. And what you need to then do is find a mechanism that says, here's how we're going to determine whether or not the South African Human Rights Commission effectively has some level of jurisdiction over that particular entity. And the general principle that appears to be being developed internationally is, if you can demonstrate that a podcast or that content or that platform is causing harm to people in South Africa, then the South African Human Rights Commission can probably go and hold them to account. But that's only on very serious issues. On all of the other issues of accuracy, or even something quite serious like defamation, if they don't belong to one of those entities and if they're outside of our jurisdiction, then you're going to really struggle to hold them accountable, unfortunately, which does show that there is a very real gap that needs to be addressed in terms of saying, how do we deal with some of these other online harms? We know, for example, platforms like X are not accountable. They operate and they have, with utter disregard to our constitution and to dealing with the kinds of very serious issues that we raise there.
And William, maybe just talk to us. Remember, I made reference to in the beginning of our interview that, of course, that gathering that you were part of, where you were talking about some possibilities in terms of regulating this space. So currently, do you know, or what can you tell us about podcasters being bound or not being bound by any ethical or legal broadcast code or framework before they actually sign to actually operate within the space? Or they just decide, look, if I've got a mic in the studio, I can just go into my house and start podcasting?
I mean, that's the benefit and the downside of having high levels of freedom of expression, which we're delighted to say that we do have, which is to say that anyone can, and indeed I think that they should be able to go and just start up a podcast, and if they can get people interested in it, good for them. I think the challenge comes when you say, well, if you're going on and making a podcast and you are claiming to be a journalist, and yet you just make things up, or you spread disinformation, or you use that podcast to cause harm, then there becomes a very real problem. So many instances, those people aren't bound by any kind of ethical code. Of course, what we're moving towards is to say we do need to rely and make sure that we rely on media and on influence people and content creators who we know are credible and are trustworthy. And it's about making sure that we can identify who they are. So SABC, for example, is one. If you're watching a podcast and it's an actual SABC podcast, then you can know that if there's something that's problematic in that, then you've got a form of redress. Where you're listening to a podcast and they're saying things that you find offensive or whatever problem you kind of have with that, unless they belong to one of those bodies, unless it's a very serious rights issue like hate speech, unfortunately, in many instances, you're unlikely to get any form of redress from them, depending on how they respond to your issue, of course.
Very concerning indeed. And I was just about to ask you, Willem, unfortunately we're out of time, in terms of how then these podcasters could even learn from legacy media frameworks like the SABC. But we're going to leave it there, William. Thank you so much, as always, for insightful input there. That is Mr.
But how did this whole drama unfold? And what does it say about media responsibility, political reaction, and the sensitivity of race and identity in South Africa? Buckle up, because this is deeper than just a simple apology. It all started when Mackenzie came across clips from an independent podcast called the Open Chat Podcast. In those clips, the presenters made inflammatory and derogatory comments about coloured South Africans, mocking their culture and even questioning their relevance in post-apartheid South Africa. The language used wasn't just offensive, it struck a nerve in a country still grappling with racial divisions. Mackenzie, being a proud advocate for coloured communities, didn't hold back. He took to social media and accused the SABC of giving a platform to what he called a hate-filled narrative. He went so far as to threaten the public broadcaster with legal action, warning that they would face serious consequences for what he believed was a calculated attack. Now here's where things get messy. The SABC was quick to respond, and they didn't mince words. In a bold and direct statement, they distanced themselves entirely from the Open Chat podcast, clarifying that the podcast was never produced, endorsed, or broadcast on any of their platforms. Not TV. Not radio, not even their digital channels. The podcast was completely independent. That left Mackenzie with a tough choice: either double down or step back. To his credit, he chose the latter. In a rare moment of humility, GAYTON MCKENZIE publicly apologized to the SABC. He admitted that he had jumped to conclusions based on misinformation and that he was wrong to associate the broadcaster with the offensive content. His apology was clear, direct, and unqualified. And let's be honest, whether you agree with his politics or not, that takes guts. Most politicians would either go silent or deflect. McKenzie faced it head-on. But the story doesn't end there. William Bird, the Director of Media Monitoring Africa, weighed in on the whole situation, offering a broader perspective. According to Bird, the entire incident is a cautionary tale about the rapid spread of misinformation and the dangers of not verifying facts before reacting publicly. He emphasized the role that political leaders play in shaping public discourse and how damaging it can be when they spread inaccurate claims. Bird also pointed out that the controversy highlights a much deeper issue, the persistent undercurrent of racial tension in the country, and how quickly those tensions can be inflamed by reckless speech, especially on unregulated platforms like podcasts. Bird made it clear that this wasn't just about one politician making a mistake. It was a wake-up call for all of us to question where we get our information, how we react to what we hear, and what responsibility we have. To the truth. He said that in an age where content goes viral in seconds, the consequences of false allegations aren't just political, they're personal, social, and even economic. Public trust in institutions like the SABC can be eroded with just one inaccurate tweet or soundbite. And that brings us back to McKenzie. His apology might have closed this particular chapter, but the issues it exposed are far from resolved. The colored community in South Africa continues to battle stereotypes and invisibility in the national narrative. They face marginalization not just from the past, but from present-day media and political discourse. And when public figures misfire, even with good intentions, the damage can be profound. So what can we take away from all of this? First, that accountability matters, even in politics. Second, that words carry weight, especially in a divided society. And third, that we all need to do better when it comes to fact-checking before we fire off accusations. McKenzie owned his mistake, and for that he deserves some credit. But let's not ignore the bigger picture. This wasn't just about a podcast or an apology. It was about power, perception, and the ongoing fight for dignity in a nation still healing. Whether you're a supporter of the Patriotic Alliance or not, whether you trust the media or question it daily, this story should make you pause. Because it shows just how quickly narratives can spiral, and how important it is for all of us to slow down, ask questions, and seek the truth. Before we speak. In a country like South Africa, where history is always in the room, those extra seconds of thought can make all the difference.